Hi, I'm Nicole Gagner. I'm a teaching artist, and I'm on the teaching artist roster for both the North Dakota and South Dakota Councils on the Arts. And today I'm going to teach you how to make simple ornaments that you can bake in your home oven. They'll get hard, and then you can decorate them also. So I'll walk you through all of that. This is a great project to do if you can't get outside, maybe it's a rainy day or something, or if you just want to have something fun to decorate around the house, around the yard, or leave them for friends and family. You can hang them on their trees, on their door handles, things like that. So it can be a super fun way to make some art and then share the art later. So I'm going to walk through two different salt dough recipes. If you have your own salt dough recipe that you've used before, feel free to use that. I love salt dough because it's just made with simple household ingredients. I'm going to walk through two different recipes because they have a little bit of a different consistency. The texture feels a little bit different on your hands. So if you've never made one before, try a different one maybe, or if you only have the ingredients for one, try that one. You definitely don't need to make both of them, but I'll just show you how to make both of them so you can kind of see how they're a little bit different. And then we'll go down to my studio, paint them up, and have them ready to share with friends and family. So the first one that I'm going to walk through is just your basic salt dough recipe. So you'll need flour. I'm using it's actually a bread flour, but any all-purpose flour, white flour. I haven't tried it with whole wheat flour. It might work, but know that if you try it with whole wheat flour, that's an experimentation that you may or may not need to change things up. So I'm going to use 2 cups of all-purpose flour. So I have a half a cup measuring cup here. So that'll be 4 halves of half cups. So 2 cups of regular flour. It doesn't have to be super duper exact. Baking a lot of times is pretty scientific about you really have to measure things out exactly for things to come together and taste right. Luckily, we aren't eating these, so they don't have to taste anyway. In fact, do not eat this dough. There's so much salt in it. It's not good for you. It's very not good for pets. Keep it away from pets. But it just has to look and feel right. So once you've made salt dough a couple times, you'll kind of get how the consistency comes together and how it feels. So that was 2 cups of flour. So I will set that aside. And then we need 1 cup of salt. This was actually the only ingredient I had to buy especially for this. We in our house normally use like sea salt or like bigger, chunkier salt. If you try to use those, the ratios might be off, and I didn't want to do the math of how much sea salt is regular table salt. So use regular table salt and then you won't have to do that crazy conversion math either. So just 1 cup of salt here. So again, in my half cup measuring cup, that's going to be two scoops. So you can see this is a lot of salt. You would not want to eat this. The salt actually here acts, it's part of the paste, but it's also a preservative. So once you bake this and dry it out completely, you shouldn't get any like mold or bugs or anything like that. So that's kind of a good thing there. And then you need 1 cup of cold water. But before I add the water in, I'm going to grab something to stir my salt and my flour together. And you don't want to add your entire cup of water at once because it's hard to go backwards if you get your dough too wet. So I'm just going to add a little bit at a time. It probably will take the whole cup of water, but maybe not quite, which is fine. So I'll add a little bit. And then if your dough is a little bit too dry, you might need to add a little bit more salt and flour, which is fine. Just know that if you are adding a little bit more, you want to keep it kind of in the same ratio, which is why I would rather start it a little bit too dry and add water, and then I don't have to figure out how much salt and flour I can add. So right now it's really dry. It almost looks like sand, so I know I definitely need some more water to help this come together. And you're looking for a dough that will stick together but not be sticky. So really it should feel almost like a gluey cookie or pie dough. But you don't want, sometimes when you make pie doughs, they're very crumbly. You don't want that in this case because you want it to be able to hold together. If you've ever made cookies or pie dough, you'll know that you don't want to over stir them because that will affect how the pie and the cookies taste. In this case, we can stir it as much as we want. If you don't want to paint your ornaments later and you want to add food coloring, now would be the time to do that along with your wet ingredients. Remember not to overdo it on the food coloring. A little goes a long way. You could also divide this up into a couple little balls and knead the food coloring in that way. I like to add my decorations at the end, and I already have acrylic paint in my studio, so I'm just going to use that. But if you don't have acrylic paint and you only have food coloring, make it colored dough instead, and that can work out great too. I am much more of a painter than a baker, so all of the color mixing for food coloring seems very off to me. And every time I try to mix the colors how they say it's going to come together on the box, it never works for me. But that might just be I haven't had enough experience using food coloring. Maybe I need a little bit more. So my dough is starting to come together now. So I will start working it with my hands. And just like any other regular bread or pie dough, part of getting it all together is kneading it. So I'm just going to start squishing it with my hands. You'll get a little bit sticky and a little bit dirty here, so be prepared for that. Once it starts to come together, you could actually turn it out on your cutting board or counter if you don't mind cleaning up a little bit of flour and stuff off of it. I'm not turning it out quite yet because it's not quite sticking together as much as I want it to. There we go. Now it's starting to really stick together. So now I think I can turn it out here. Might get a little bit messy. That's all right. That's part of making art. All right. So I'm just going to knead this for a little while until this all comes together as a nice sticky dough. Like I said, if this isn't all clinging together, I might need a tiny bit more water, but I'm just going to knead this and see if it all starts coming together. As you knead the dough, it starts to kind of hydrate it and kind of soak everything in. So I think that this might all come together now. All right, and I'm going to keep kneading at this dough until it doesn't feel grainy anymore. Maybe adding a little bit more moisture if needed. Kneading the dough really might take a while, might take up to 5 minutes. So we'll just keep kneading here and kind of adding a little bit of moisture as we go. Okay, so I've been kneading for almost 5 minutes now. It's starting to come together. You can see it looks kind of like a squishy bread dough or pie dough or something like that. I've noticed too, if you let it kind of sit for a little while before you use it, it comes together even better. You don't want to let it sit out exposed though, so either cover it up or even stick it in a Ziploc bag or something like that and let it sit for a little bit, and that will all come together. You can use this with a rolling pin or just kind of form it with your hands, and I'll talk about that in my studio in just a second. I'll set this aside so I can make the other dough. So this dough is kind of known as the better than salt dough, but I don't personally think that one is better or worse than the other. It's just a little bit different. Some people really don't like the feel of the salt in the salt dough, and sometimes the regular traditional salt dough can be a tiny bit fragile. I think that the better than salt dough is a little bit harder to make and harder to work with, but they do last longer once you've made them. So kind of a horse apiece. Maybe just let whichever ingredients you have in your kitchen dictate which one you use, because once you've made the doughs, they act pretty similar. So I'm going to get out a 1/2 cup of cornstarch, regular cornstarch from my cabinet. And again, maybe be a little bit more clean than me. I'm an artist, not a baker. The measurements don't have to be quite as exact as if you were baking bread or cookies or something like that, where the exact science of how they work together is really important. This just needs to kind of feel right for the dough. So a 1/2 cup of cornstarch to 1 cup of baking soda. We buy this in bulk for our laundry, so I'm just going to pour out of here. So 1 cup of baking soda, So that'll be 2 of my little half cup measuring cups. I swear I'm not normally this messy of a dough maker. Today it's just going everywhere. All right. And then for this one, we're only going to need 3/4 of a cup of water. But again, don't dump in all of the water at once. Kind of add it slowly and watch the dough come together. You're looking for a really soupy consistency right now, but you don't want it like a really thin soup. It's more like a gloopy potato soup, if that makes sense. And the reason this is so runny at first is because the cornstarch actually needs to get cooked up a little bit before it all comes together. But you can cook it either stovetop and just stir it until it looks like about the consistency of mashed potatoes. Or if you have a microwave safe bowl like I do and would rather do it in your microwave, that works too. I'm not much of a chef myself, so microwaves are a little bit more of my comfort zone. So at first it was really thick, and now that I'm stirring it together, it's starting to get pretty thin. I didn't use all 3/4 of a cup of my water. I'll probably add a tiny bit more just to thin it out, but that's just more water that's gonna need to cook off in the end. So if you've got a nice thin consistency, that's pretty good. You're going to hang on to your fork though, because we're going to take it out of the microwave every 30 seconds to stir it. In past experience, I've usually had to do about 1.5 to 2.5 minutes worth of cooking in the microwave. Stovetop, it might take 5 or 10 minutes to come together, just depending on how high of heat you have. Definitely don't put it on the highest heat if you're doing stovetop, because you don't want to burn it. So we'll cook this up and then I'll turn it out and show you how it looks. All right, so of course, like always, this recipe made a little bit of a liar out of me. I had to microwave it. I think I went for almost 3 minutes, maybe a little bit more. So just really keep going. You'll know when it's done. When it sticks to your fork, it's not drippy. It's going to be really hot, so you won't be able to feel the consistency of it yet, but it should look like a really thick scoop of mashed potatoes. So I'm going to stir it one more time, and then I'm going to set this aside to let it cool. You want it to be cool to the touch so you can handle it. But those are our 2 doughs there. Like I said, now, once you've mixed them up, they'll work the exact same. So once this has cooled, I'll take them both down to my studio and I'll show you how you can use them like clay, mold them. If you want to keep working in your kitchen, of course, there are some great tools in here. Rolling pins, forks, you could find funky textures with things that you can press into the dough. So work in your kitchen, on a table, anywhere that you feel comfortable. The dough might stick a little bit to a tablecloth, and then if you're using acrylic or tempera paint later, that would definitely possibly stain things. So you might want to put down like newspaper or plastic or something while you work. But yeah, I'll let this cool and then I'll see you down in the studio to finish them up. All right. So this is my one of my finished ornaments here. You can see after I formed it, just like this one, I've painted it with acrylic paint and then put a little string or ribbon through it so that I can hang it around. So what I'm going to do here, these ones were kind of rolled a little bit more flat and then cut out, and I kind of embossed them. So if you want to make something like that, you just need a tool to kind of carve into the surface. I'll set all of these aside here. This is my texture making tool. Set this guy aside too, because I want to grab a little bit of my dough. And you can see it's really pretty close to the consistency of a pie dough. When you're making your dough, if it feels a little bit too sticky, you can add a little bit more of your dry ingredients. If it feels a little bit too dry, you can add a little bit of water, but you don't want it to be too dry where you can't work it. So I'm just gonna form this out here and I'll show you. If you have a rolling pin, you can absolutely use that. I'm just gonna form it with my hands here. If you want to protect your work surface, you can work on a cutting board or something like that, especially as you're kneading the dough together and making it. But now that I've got it all rolled out, it should be pretty easy to work with here. You don't want it to get too thin there. So if it gets a little bit too thin or starts to rip apart, you can always just push it back together with your fingers. All right, so now that that is pretty even there, I've kind of got it even on both sides. I can flip it around one more time. You can see if your surface is a little bit dirty, like mine has a little bit of paint and stuff, your dough might pick up a little bit of it, but that's okay because we're gonna paint this in the end. So what I'm gonna do is just quickly draw something to kind of figure out what shape I want, but I'm not gonna push all the way through right away because I wanna make sure that I like the shape that I've got there. I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe I'll make it a little bit bigger over here. And then you can just push all the way through. Like I said, if you have a butter knife, that can work great for this too. Any kind of pointy tool. If you use like a pencil or a pen, just be careful that you don't accidentally write on your table underneath. If you are using kind of a dull instrument like I am, it might make kind of a jagged edge. So we'll just have to smooth those edges out with our fingers. And if it doesn't want to smooth out, like if your dough is a little bit drier than mine is, you might just need to wet your fingers a tiny bit to help it smooth out a little bit easier there. All right. So now I've got a shape that I like there, and we can reuse this dough. You don't have to toss that extra dough. When you're making cookies, every time you re-roll it, it gets a little bit tougher. For us, tough in the ornaments is not a bad thing. So we'll just keep re-rolling and reusing all of our materials here. Kind of smooth out those edges a little bit. And one thing you want to keep in mind is when your ornament bakes off and hardens, it'll be really, really hard. So you won't be able to put a hole in it later. So if you want to be able to hang this up and put it somewhere as like a decorative little hanging ornament, you will need a hole punched in it for that ribbon to go through. So you can make a hole right in the middle here. You can make a hole off to the side. Entirely up to you where you want to make your hole, but you want to make it nice and big because sometimes it wants to shrink a little bit as it bakes. It'll tighten up a little bit. So we've got a hole there, and now I can grab my texturing tool and make some marks in here if I want. I could go side to side, back and forth. You don't have to texture. Maybe you want your decoration to come when you paint on it later. Totally up to you how you want to make this ornament your own. I rolled my dough maybe a little too thin here because every time I move it, it's kind of stretching out, but that's all right. If you end up not really liking exactly how you rolled your ornament out, you have quite a while to work with it before it gets too dry to handle. So now this is pretty satisfactory. I'm pretty happy with that for my first one. So I'll set that on a baking sheet that's lined in parchment and bake it. The instructions that I wrote up say you want to bake it at a low temperature, 175 degrees, until it is dried all the way through, and then let it cool before you paint. So it should be, if it's thin like this, it should be dry in an hour or so. If you do a thick one like this, it might take a little bit longer. And it's a good idea to every half an hour or so kind of flip it over so it bakes evenly. So if you want to do a thicker ornament like this, I'm just forming these with my hands. So I just rolled a ball here, and then you can borrow a little tool to kind of press down and start that little heart shape there. And then you can pinch the bottom and kind of round that out until you get a heart shape that you like. And just keep in mind, wherever you're hanging your heart from, that hole is going to need to be nice and big again. So when you put that through, you'll want to wiggle it around, and that might make your shape a little bit uneven. So now I can come back and even this guy out. And if he gets a little bit too flat, you can kind of squeeze him with your fingers to bulk him back up. And just kind of play around with those shapes. There's really no right or wrong here. So just kind of play around with it and see what kind of hearts you like to make, or if you like to make other shapes. I'm going to set these aside now. I'll throw them in my oven, get these baked up. But in the meantime, I will pull out one of these ones that's already finished and show you how you can paint them up and get them finished. So let me grab some paint and we'll get started on that next. All right, so to take my white baked dough ornament here to a more finished one like this guy here, I'm using acrylic paint. If you have tempera or another type of paint, that could work too. But if you are going to leave your ornaments outside, you might want to seal them if it's anything else. Acrylic paint is kind of a sealant in itself, so it'll help it last a little bit longer. So I've got some paint mix from projects I was working on earlier, and I will just show you what I do to get started here. So if I want to follow some of the patterns that I started earlier, I can do that and kind of follow those lines here. But really how you paint these ornaments is pretty up to you. You can get as creative as you would like. Really just kind of mix and get creative, enjoy it. There's no right or wrong. The really nice thing about acrylic paint too is that if I decide later, like, oh, I'm not really liking this, I want to do something a little bit different, I would just let this dry and I can go right over the top of it. Acrylic paint is pretty forgiving, as long as you just kind of let it dry in between. There's really all multitude of things will be forgiven as long as you let it dry. You can paint right over the top of it. So I'm kind of happy for that one now. I do want to paint the other side of this too, and then maybe I'll come back and do some other things on it. But I want to let my one side dry before I flip it over and try to paint the other side so that it doesn't get too messy on me. You can see I've put a little bit of plastic down. If you have newspapers or something, that can work also. I already have a lot of paint on my desk, but I figured I should protect it just a little bit more. So I'll start painting this guy here too. Like I said, there's really no right or wrong color schemes here, whatever seems fun to you. With acrylic paint, you don't want to water down your paint. If you water it down too much, like you can see that one was a little bit see-through there because I had water on my brush. If you water it down too much, it's actually not going to make a nice protective coat. The binder of the paint will start to kind of break up and it won't seal it as well. So you want to have a nice, good even layer of paint there. I don't want to say a thick layer of paint necessarily. If you put your paint on too thick, it takes a long time to dry. So that's something to keep in mind. Kind of walk that balance between how much paint you want to put on at a time. Kind of making a checkerboard pattern here, but just kind of play around with it, try out a couple different things, see what you like. And I will finish one of these up and then I'll just show you threading it through with a ribbon. So once these are all completely painted on both sides, if I missed any spots like this, I can either come back with more paint or even like a clear coat. If I kind of like the natural dough showing through, that's fine too. And then when these are all done, you string them up with a ribbon so you can hang them around your house, around town. These are really cute outside. This is a polyester thread. I would recommend using that or some kind of artificial ribbon so that it won't break down too quickly. Although, you know, twine or something natural like that can still last for quite a while too. So kind of, this is one of those projects, use what you have around the house, kind of make it your own. And hopefully you can brighten somebody's day by leaving those around. All right, well, that's going to do it for me today. I hope you had fun following along and hopefully making a little bit of art of your own. If you use some of these to kind of cheer up your house or leave some for friends or family, I would love to hear about it. So please find me. I'm Painter Nicole on Facebook and Instagram. Thanks again for the South Dakota Council on the Arts for all of the support, helping artists to connect to people who are staying safe at home but want a little bit of inspiration to keep them getting creative while they are staying safe at home. Hopefully the next time I see you guys, it'll be sunny out so I can show you a few more things we can do with art supplies we find around the house and get inspired that way. So until next time, thanks so much.